It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon when Maria Green, the mayor of a small southern town, was driving home from a meeting with community leaders, her mind buzzing with ideas for the next phase of her town's revitalization plan. She had just signed a new initiative aimed at boosting local businesses and improving the school system. She had spent weeks working on the project, and it was finally coming together perfectly. She smiled to herself as the sunset casting an orange glow across the road in front of her. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment when suddenly the blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't speeding, she had been paying attention to the road, but she pulled over anyway. The young officer walked up to her car, his face hard to read. As he glanced at her through the window, she rolled it down and greeted him politely, though she could feel a slight unease settle in. The officer asked for her license and registration, and she handed them over without hesitation. As he looked at her ID, a small frown appeared on his face. He didn't recognize her name, and she didn't think anything of it. She had been in the public eye for years, but in this moment, she was just another citizen pulled over for what seemed to be no real reason. The officer returned to his car with her information, and Mariah couldn't help but wonder why he had stopped her in the first place. She hadn't been speeding, at least not in any significant way. The road was quiet, and the traffic light she had just passed was green. She leaned back in her seat, trying to shake off the sense of annoyance. She had always prided herself on being calm under pressure. She was a mayor after all, but something about this encounter felt off. After a few minutes, the officer returned to her car with a ticket in hand. He handed it to her without a word of explanation, just a blank stare. His tone was dismissive as he told her she had been speeding and that she needed to be more careful next time. Maria took the ticket from his hand, her fingers brushing his slightly, and her eyes locked with his. For a moment, she could feel the subtle judgment in his gaze, but she said nothing. Instead, she nodded and thanked him before he turned and walked back to his patrol car. She sat there for a moment, stunned. It wasn't the fine that bothered her, it was the feeling that the officer hadn't seen her as a person, but as just another black woman to be dealt with in the same way he dealt with everyone else. The mayor of the town was just another face in the crowd, a simple infraction that he could dismiss without thinking twice about who she really was. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would stick with her longer than it should have. She had worked so hard for everything she had achieved, and yet it seemed like none of it mattered in that moment. She was just another black woman, receiving a ticket from a young white officer who didn't even care enough to recognize her as someone who held any power in the community. She couldn't help but wonder how many other people in this town had experienced the same kind of treatment, and she made a vow to herself that she would confront it head-on when the time came to do so. A few weeks later, Maria found herself once again standing in the courthouse, though this time it was not for an important town meeting or gathering with community leaders. It was for something far less anticipated, a minor traffic ticket that had somehow grown into a much bigger issue. As she sat in the waiting area surrounded by a mix of people from all walks of life, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Despite the fact that it was just a routine court appearance to deal with a speeding ticket, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching her in a way that made everything feel much more significant. Her name was called, and she walked into the courtroom with her usual poise, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the cold tile floor. She stood before Judge Samuel Winters, a man who had earned a reputation for being strict but fair. As the room grew quiet, she glanced at the judge, his stern expression seemingly focused on the paperwork in front of him. Without a hint of recognition, when he looked up at her, he appeared unmoved, his eyes scanning the details of the ticket with an air of indifference. "Ms. Green," Judge Winters began, his voice firm and authoritative, "you've been cited for speeding 20 miles over the limit. This is a serious violation." He glanced up at her briefly, but said nothing to acknowledge her appearance. As the town's mayor, his eyes simply moved back to the paperwork. "I'm imposing a fine of $300 and expect you to pay it promptly," he continued, his words cold and final. Maria stood silently, her heart beating faster than she would have liked. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, but she refused to show any sign of discomfort. Her gaze remained steady as she took in his words. She was no stranger to the law, and certainly no stranger to being judged. But something about this moment felt different, something about the way the judge spoke to her made it clear he saw her as no more than just another name on a list of people who had broken the rules, not as the leader of their town, not as someone who had worked tirelessly to improve the lives of everyone in that very room. She nodded once, acknowledging the fine, and turned to leave without saying a word, her mind racing. As she walked out of the courtroom, the sound of the gavel still echoing in her ears. She had been calm, but inside her frustration was building. Why had she been treated with such disregard? Was it because of the assumptions people made about her as a black woman, or was it simply because the judge did not know who she was? What would have happened if he had recognized her as the mayor? Would he have treated her differently? Would he have taken a moment to consider the weight of his actions? Or had he just assumed she was someone who could be dismissed with a fine and a few harsh words? As she walked out into the hallway, a clerk who had been standing nearby glanced up from her desk, her eyes widening in realization. She quickly turned to her colleague and whispered something under her breath. Maria could hear the words, but she didn't react immediately. She had been in this position before, people whispering about her behind her back, assuming things about her based on her race and her gender. She had learned to tune it out, but this time it was different. This time the clerk knew who she was, and it wasn't long before the information made its way back to the judge. As Maria stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. She had been calm, collected, and professional, as she always tried to be, but something about that encounter had rubbed her the wrong way. The judge's cold, dismissive tone, his failure to acknowledge who she was, felt like a direct hit, even though it was wrapped up in the formalities of the court system. She took a deep breath as she walked down the hallway, the sound of her shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. But before she could get too far, a voice called out behind her, "Ms. Green?" She turned around, her brow furrowing. It was the clerk, standing a few feet away, looking at her with wide eyes. There was a mixture of shock and something else, concern or maybe guilt. I just realized who you are," the clerk stammered, almost as if she were afraid to speak too loudly. Maria raised an eyebrow, already sensing what was coming. "You didn't recognize me earlier?" she asked, her voice even but carrying an edge of curiosity. The clerk's face reddened, and she quickly lowered her gaze. "No, ma'am, I didn't. But now I see. You're the mayor of the town. I didn't realize it was you. I'm so sorry." Maria blinked in surprise, the pieces falling into place. The judge had not recognized her either. That's why he had treated her like just another citizen who had committed a minor infraction. A sinking feeling settled in her chest, and she fought to keep her composure. It wasn't just that she had been fined. It was the realization that the system had treated her as if she didn't matter, as if her position and influence in the town were irrelevant. The way she had been looked at, the way she had been addressed, made it clear that, in that moment, the judge had seen her through a lens that was different from the one he might have used for others. "Do you think he knew who I was?" Maria asked, her voice quiet but sharp. The clerk seemed unsure of how to answer, so Maria continued, "The judge? Did he recognize me after?" The clerk hesitated, glancing down the hall as if looking for someone to answer for her. "No, ma'am, he didn't," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't think he realized until after you left. When I told him who you were, his face went pale, and he seemed, well, a bit flustered." Maria nodded slowly, feeling the sting of the moment. She could only imagine what the judge's reaction had been. Surprise, maybe even embarrassment. But it was the dismissiveness before the recognition that cut deeper. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the disregard. The assumption that she was just another person, a name on a paper. It spoke volumes about how she, a black woman in power, was still seen as secondary by some, as less than her position. Suddenly, Maria felt the weight of the entire encounter. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed because of their appearance or background, everyone who had been overlooked and undervalued despite their worth. She had hoped for fairness in that courtroom, an expectation that the law would treat her equally as it should anyone. Instead, she had been reminded of the subtle biases that often go unnoticed, that shape the way people are treated, even in the halls of justice. "I'll be fine," she said to the clerk, forcing a smile. "Thank you for telling me, but I need to speak to the judge." As she walked back toward the courtroom, she already knew this wasn't over. The fine could be paid, the paperwork could be filed, but the issue she had just encountered, assumptions made about her simply because of who she was not something that could be ignored. This was bigger than a ticket. This was a statement about the town, about the system, and about how much work was still needed to bring about true fairness. She was determined to address it head on, to make sure no one else felt as invisible as she had in that courtroom. And in the process, maybe, just maybe, she would make those in power see that people like her, people who had fought to change the town, should never be overlooked again. The morning after her court appearance, Maria sat at her desk in the mayor's office, staring at the ticket in front of her. The fine was not the issue. It was the underlying message that had been sent. She thought about the many people who had probably experienced the same thing. Those who had been dismissed or marginalized because of who they were, how they looked, or their position in life. She had spent her career advocating for fairness and equal treatment for all citizens, but this experience made her realize how deep-seated the biases were in even the most trusted institutions. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her press secretary, Ander. "Maria, we need to talk. The press is starting to catch wind of what happened in court yesterday. You should address it before it gets out of hand." She sat back in her chair and exhaled. There was no way to avoid it now. The media would run with this, whether she spoke out or not. The question was how she would frame it. Would she let the story simply be about a fine, or would she turn it into a conversation about systemic biases and accountability? She took a moment, then dialed Anders' number. "I'll address it publicly," she said, her voice firm. "But I need it to be clear. This isn't just about a speeding ticket. It's about how we view each other, how we treat people based on assumptions, not reality." Later that afternoon, Maria stood before a small crowd of reporters outside the town hall. The press had gathered quickly, and their cameras flashed as she stepped up to the microphone. Her stance was confident, but the weight of the situation was heavy. She had known this day would come, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "Yesterday, I was issued a speeding ticket by an officer, and I appeared in court to handle it as any other citizen would. But what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about a fine or a violation of traffic laws. It was about the assumptions that were made, not only by the officer who issued the ticket, but by the judge who sentenced me." She paused, letting her words sink in. The reporters leaned in, their pens ready. She could feel the weight of the moment, but she pressed on. "As a black woman in power, I have often encountered assumptions based on my appearance and my race. Yesterday, I was treated no differently. I was treated as just another person to be judged without any consideration of who I am or the work I've done for this town. And while I understand that the law must be applied equally to everyone, what happened to me speaks to a deeper issue, one that goes beyond just the courtroom." Maria's words hung in the air. She could see the reporters scribbling, the cameras capturing every word. The message was clear. She wasn't just responding to a personal slight. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been overlooked or unfairly treated based on assumptions. This wasn't just about her. It was about the system that continued to perpetuate such injustices, even in places of authority. "I'm not here to complain about a fine," she continued, her voice steady. "I'm here to challenge us all to reflect on how we treat one another. We need to ask ourselves if we are truly judging people fairly, or if we are making decisions based on stereotypes or biases that have no place in our society." She could feel the energy shift in the crowd. This was bigger than a speeding ticket, bigger than a single courthouse incident. This was a conversation that needed to happen. Change doesn't come by ignoring the problem. It comes when we face it head on and start doing the work to fix it. "I'm committed to that work, and I hope others will be too," she concluded, looking directly at the cameras. "We owe it to each other to create a community where everyone is seen, heard, and respected." As Maria finished her statement and stepped away from the microphone, a sense of purpose settled within her. She had spoken out not just for herself, but for the countless others who had faced similar experiences, people who had felt invisible or undervalued. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but she was determined to continue the fight for fairness and equality in her town. The cameras snapped one last time, and as Maria turned to walk back inside, she felt a quiet resolve growing inside her. This was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. The news of Maria's courtroom encounter quickly spread throughout the town, and the reaction was far more intense than she had expected. People from all walks of life reached out to her, some offering words of support, others questioning why she had taken such a strong stance over a simple ticket. But it was the unexpected messages that resonated most with her. Messages from people she didn't know, from individuals who had been silent in the past, suddenly speaking up to say they had experienced the same kind of treatment, whether it was in the courtroom, at work, or even within their own families. Maria knew the battle wasn't over, but the groundswell of support felt like a confirmation that she wasn't alone in this fight. The issue she had raised went beyond the confines of her own experience. It was about a larger systemic problem that needed to be addressed. A few days after her public statement, Maria received a call that surprised her. It was from Judge Samuel Winters, the same judge who had imposed the fine in the first place. She almost didn't know how to respond when she saw his name on her phone. She had expected the situation to end with her public address, but this was different. Mayor Green, his voice came through the phone, hesitating at first. "I wanted to personally apologize for the way things went down in court. I did not recognize you when you walked in, and I'm embarrassed by how I handled the situation. I wasn't aware of your position, and I acted without giving you the respect you deserve." Maria was momentarily taken aback. She had not expected an apology, especially not from someone in a position of authority. In her mind, apologies from those who hold power often come with strings attached, a desire for forgiveness rather than genuine accountability. But there was something in Judge Winters' voice that seemed sincere. "I appreciate your apology, Judge," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But it's not just about me. It's about how the system can fail people, whether they are in power or not. It's about making sure we all, no matter who we are treated with respect and fairness." "I understand that now," he replied, "and I assure you, this experience has changed my perspective. I'm committed to being more mindful in the future." Maria didn't know what to make of the conversation. Was it a genuine shift, or was he simply trying to smooth things over? Still, she had to acknowledge that the apology was a start. Not everyone in his position would have reached out to her directly. But the real surprise came shortly after, when a local community leader, David Lewis, reached out to her for a meeting. David was a well-known advocate for civil rights in the town, someone who had been vocal about systemic issues long before Maria was elected. He had always been supportive of her, but this time, his message felt different. "I saw your statement," David said when they sat down in her office, "and I have to say, I respect the way you've handled this. This isn't just a personal issue. This is about our entire community, the ways in which people of color have been treated unfairly in our justice system. We need to do more than just talk about it. We need action." Maria listened intently as David laid out ideas for community discussions, town hall meetings, and partnerships with local organizations to bring awareness to racial inequality in the justice system. He didn't just want to acknowledge the problem. He wanted to create concrete solutions. Maria was inspired by his vision, and she could feel the weight of responsibility growing heavier on her shoulders. But she also felt something else, a sense of hope. "Let's do it," Maria said, her voice full of resolve. "This town deserves better, and I'm not going to stop until we get it." The two of them began planning a series of meetings with local community members, law enforcement, and the justice system to discuss reforms. It was clear that this conversation, which had begun with a simple traffic violation, was snowballing into something much bigger. It was no longer just about Maria Green and her experience. It was about the entire town, about everyone who had ever felt dismissed or silenced. As the days went on, more voices began to join the conversation, some hesitant at first, others eager to get involved. Maria knew it was going to be a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a genuine sense of unity building. The town wasn't just listening. They were starting to act, and Maria was ready to lead them every step of the way. The days following Maria's public statement were filled with a growing sense of anticipation and tension. The town was buzzing, and opinions were divided. While many supported her courage in speaking out, others were uncomfortable with the way she had addressed the issue. Some felt that it had been an overreaction to a minor infraction, while others questioned her motivations. The local media had picked up the story, framing it as a scandal, and soon Maria found herself at the center of a storm she had not anticipated. As the weeks passed, the community seemed to fracture. On one side, people rallied behind her, organizing petitions, holding rallies, and even offering to pay the fine for her. They saw her as a symbol of resistance against an unjust system that had long failed people of color. On the other side, critics began to paint her as an opportunist, using the situation to advance a personal agenda regardless of the cost to the community's reputation. Local radio talk shows stirred the pot, debating whether the mayor had overstepped by turning a simple speeding ticket into a national issue. Maria knew that she had sparked something bigger than she had intended. This was no longer about her or her fine. It was about the larger issues of race, power, and equality in her community. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. The issue had unearthed deep, unresolved tensions within the town. Her phone rang late one night, disturbing her from a moment of reflection. It was Ander, her press secretary, his voice tense. "Maria, you need to brace yourself. There's been an incident at the police department. A video's gone viral." Maria's heart sank. She quickly turned on the news and saw a clip circulating of a local police officer, now identified as Officer Daniel Griggs, engaging in a tense confrontation with a young black man during a routine traffic stop. The video showed the officer using force when the young man, who had been cooperative, reached for his wallet. The footage had been taken by a passerby, and the outrage was immediate. Comments flooded social media, drawing connections between the incident and the larger issues that Maria had been trying to address. The next morning, Maria stood in front of a crowded press conference. Her thoughts were scattered, but she knew she had to act. The video had not only reignited the debate about race and policing, but it had also created a storm that threatened to overshadow everything she had worked for. I'm deeply disturbed by the video that has surfaced, Maria began, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. We cannot ignore what we've seen. This is not just about a single officer. This is about a system that has allowed these types of incidents to happen again and again. I know that our community is hurting, and I stand with those who are demanding justice and accountability. She paused, taking a breath before continuing. We will be working with the police department to ensure that an independent investigation is launched into the incident, and I will personally make sure that those responsible are held accountable. But let me be clear, this is not just about one officer. This is about making sure that every single person in our community, no matter their race, is treated with dignity and respect. The press conference was tense, but Maria's words struck a chord. There were murmurs of approval from some members of the audience, but others remained silent, clearly skeptical of her stance. Maria knew that taking a strong position would alienate some, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. As the cameras turned off and reporters began to disperse, Ander approached her. His face was drawn, and he looked exhausted. "That was powerful," he said quietly. "But you know this is going to get uglier before it gets better. You're stepping into deep waters here." Maria nodded. "I've known that all along, but I can't back down now." The following days were filled with protests, heated debates at town meetings, and calls for both the police officer's dismissal and for broader reforms within the justice system. While Maria's position had made her a target for those who disagreed with her, it had also drawn in new allies, people who were eager to stand with her and demand lasting change. Despite the chaos swirling around her, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that the community was at a crossroads. There was no going back. The issue was too big to ignore, too deep to gloss over. And though tensions were high, there was also an undeniable energy in the air, a desire for something better, something fairer. As she sat in her office that night, reviewing the latest reports and organizing her next steps, Maria knew that the path forward would be challenging. But for the first time, it felt like the town was ready to confront its demons head-on. And with the support of those who truly believed in change, she was determined to lead them into a new era of justice and equality. As the weeks passed, Maria's initiative to address systemic inequalities in the justice system gained momentum. Her public statement had sparked a much-needed conversation, but it was the town's response that truly marked the beginning of change. What started as a personal grievance over a traffic ticket had transformed into a widespread movement, with local organizations, civic leaders, and citizens coming together to explore how they could reshape the way people were treated in their community. The first town hall meeting was packed. Maria stood at the front, watching as more than 100 people filed into the community center, eager to listen, discuss, and contribute. The diversity of voices in the room was powerful, a reflection of the wide-ranging experiences people in the town had with law enforcement and the justice system. David Lewis, the civil rights advocate who had reached out to her, stood beside Maria, ready to moderate the discussion. As he began speaking, the crowd grew quiet, the gravity of the moment settling in. "This isn't just about one ticket," David said, his voice carrying through the room. "It's about recognizing that every single one of us deserves to be treated with fairness and dignity, no matter our race, gender, or background. It's about taking responsibility for our actions and working to make sure that everyone has a voice in our community." Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as she watched people from all walks of life lean in, eager to engage in a conversation that many had long avoided. The energy in the room was palpable, an energy that was focused on healing and building understanding, not division. The meeting started with open-floor discussions where people shared their personal experiences with the justice system. Some stories were heartbreaking, tales of being racially profiled or mistreated by law enforcement. Others spoke of feeling marginalized or invisible in legal settings, their voices ignored because of their background. These were stories that needed to be told. The town needed to hear them. But there were also voices of support, police officers, local business owners, and teachers, all acknowledging that the town had work to do. The police chief, a man who had served in the community for decades, stood up to speak. "I've seen firsthand how biases can affect interactions between officers and the community," Chief Carter said, his voice steady but sincere. "I know there are things we need to change in our department. We're committed to starting a series of workshops on bias training, de-escalation tactics, and community engagement. It's not enough to just say we're doing better. We have to show it every day." The room erupted into applause. Maria could feel the shift happening right before her eyes. People who had been reluctant to speak out were now standing together, unified by a shared desire for progress. It wasn't just about policy changes, it was about healing wounds that had festered for too long. As the meeting drew to a close, Maria stepped up to the podium, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," she began. "This is just the beginning, but we've taken the first step toward making our community better for all of us. We've acknowledged that there are challenges, and we're committed to facing them together. I've always believed that the power of a community lies in its ability to come together, to have difficult conversations, and to push for change. And that's exactly what we're doing here tonight." The applause was loud and heartfelt, and Maria felt a deep sense of gratitude for the way her town had embraced this conversation. They were no longer just discussing issues in isolation. They were addressing them collectively, and that made all the difference. The road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. There was a clear path forward, one that was being built together, brick by brick. As people began to leave the meeting, there was a sense of optimism in the air. It was clear that the town was ready to tackle the challenges that lay ahead, and Maria was ready to lead them through it. This was more than just a political fight. It was a fight for dignity, equality, and respect for everyone, no matter their background. And with that, the work began in earnest. Months passed, and the movement that had been ignited by a simple traffic ticket continued to build momentum. The town was slowly but surely beginning to change. Maria's initiative, coupled with the strong community support, had opened the door to real transformation. She had never imagined that a single moment of injustice would spark such a sweeping shift, but she was determined to keep pushing forward, to make sure that the conversation didn't stop. The town hall meetings became a regular fixture, and each one grew in size and significance. They weren't just about discussing the issues anymore, they were about creating solutions. Local leaders, community members, and law enforcement began working together in ways that had never been seen before. Maria, though grateful for the progress, knew that the real challenge lay ahead. It wasn't enough to talk about change. They had to implement it, to make it sustainable. The police department rolled out its new diversity training program. Officers attended workshops that focused on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and de-escalation techniques. The program wasn't a one-time fix, but an ongoing effort to shift the department's culture from top to bottom. Chief Carter, who had initially expressed his commitment to change, was leading the charge, and Maria found herself meeting with him regularly to ensure that progress was being made. "I've seen a real change in the department," Chief Carter said one afternoon as he sat across from her in her office. "The officers are more engaged, more mindful of how they approach situations. It's not perfect, but we're making strides." Maria nodded, encouraged by his words but understanding that change was a long process. She had seen enough in her years of public service to know that change, especially when it came to deep-rooted biases, didn't happen overnight. But the small victories were significant. Officers were attending community events, engaging with residents in ways they hadn't before, and taking steps to be more transparent in their practices. At the same time, Maria worked on strengthening relationships with local organizations that were focused on racial equality, education, and economic opportunity. She pushed for policies that would support underserved communities, such as increased funding for local schools, better access to healthcare, and job training programs for those most affected by systemic inequities. The impact of her efforts was becoming visible. Unemployment rates in the town began to decrease as new programs and initiatives were introduced. Public schools saw improvements as funding was allocated to support after-school programs and educational resources for disadvantaged students. More and more young people, especially those from marginalized communities, found new pathways to success that had previously been out of reach. But the true measure of progress wasn't just in the statistics, it was in the way the town began to feel. The air seemed lighter, more open. People who had once been reluctant to speak up were now finding their voices. Businesses were investing in the local community, knowing that they were part of something bigger than profit, that they were helping to create a place where equality and opportunity weren't just ideals but realities. One of the most moving moments for Maria came when she attended a graduation ceremony at the local high school. The student body was more diverse than it had been in years past, and as she watched the graduates walk across the stage, she felt a profound sense of pride. Many of the students had come from neighborhoods that had been historically neglected, but now they were stepping into the world with a sense of hope and possibility. After the ceremony, one of the graduates, a young black woman named Tasha, approached her. "Mayor Green," Tasha said, her voice filled with gratitude, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. I wouldn't be standing here today without the changes you've helped bring about." Maria smiled warmly, her heart swelling with emotion. "You did the hard work, Tasha. I'm just happy I could be part of your journey." As the day came to a close and Maria walked out of the school, she reflected on everything that had happened. The road had been long and at times difficult, but the change was undeniable. It wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about a community coming together to face uncomfortable truths, to address injustices, and to take meaningful steps toward creating a more equitable future. Maria knew that there would always be more work to do, more challenges to face. But as she looked around her town, she saw the beginnings of something new. A future where people were seen, heard, and valued. A future where change wasn't just an idea, but a reality.